On October 9th of 1999, 19-year-old Rocio Wanninkhof left home in La Cala de Mijas, Spain, and started heading to her boyfriend's house for a dinner date. Her boyfriend was Antonio Jose Jurado, and they planned to go to a festival with some friends after dinner. After they ate, Rocio returned home to shower and change, then went back to Antonio's house. The next day, Rocio's mother, Alicia Hornos, realized that her daughter had not made it home. She tried to call Rocio, but she never picked up. She then called Rocio's sister, Rosa, and asked her to find Rocio. Rosa met up with Antonio and asked about her sister, and Antonio said that they hadn't even gone to the festival the previous night because he was too tired. Antonio had gone to bed early, and Rocio was gone by the time he woke up. Rosa proceeded to contact all of Rocio's friends, but none of them had any information. Alicia and Rosa decided to retrace Rocio's movements from the previous night. They walked along the same route that Rocio had taken, which led them to an uphill gravel road with no streetlights. On this stretch of road, they found a large patch of dried blood. The blood extended off to the roadside, and when they followed it, they found Rocio's sneakers and handkerchief. Alicia and Rosa immediately called the police. Officers were deployed in a search effort, and this expanded to include 600 local volunteers. They scoured nearby urban areas, suburbs, and the wilderness, and the police began looking into Rocio's relationships with friends and her boyfriend. In addition to the bloodstain, the police found tire tracks that belonged to a Ford Fiesta at the crime scene. A cigarette butt was also found nearby, and the DNA belonged to a man, but there were no matches in the Spanish database. Several days later, a taxi driver came forward and told the police that he had almost been struck by a reckless driver on the night of Rocio's disappearance. The driver had been on the wrong side of the road at the same spot where Rocio's blood was found. When the vehicle passed, the witness heard a loud scream. On October 16th, the DNA test of the bloodstain confirmed that it was Rocio's blood. The police offered a 25 million pesetas reward for information leading to Rocio. On November 2nd, the police received a report of a dead body near a tennis court parking lot about 28 kilometers away from the scene of Rocio's blood. The body had been placed in a gap between the fence and the outer edge of the tennis court. The police also found a black garbage bag next to the fence. The body was badly decomposed and partially skeletonized, but the authorities were able to collect DNA samples. On November 6th, the results came back as a match for Rocio. The autopsy revealed an extremely violent death. There were extensive signs of beating on her body, as well as 9 stab wounds. There were also burn marks that suggested the killer had attempted to dissolve the body in acid. The cause of death was blood loss. Rocio's clothing was found inside the garbage bag, but the medical examiner was unable to determine whether or not SA had been committed. They found 2 textile fibers on the body, but their origins were a mystery. The police also pulled a fingerprint from the garbage bag, but it did not match anyone on file. Law enforcement believed that the motive had been revenge, given how most of the stab wounds were concentrated in one area, and the killer had clearly continued stabbing after she was already dead, which suggested a personal attack. It was also very likely that the killer was familiar with the local area due to the strange location of the body dump. The first suspect in the murder was Antonio, who the police quickly arrested. Antonio claimed that he had been asleep at the time. He didn't remember what Rocio had been wearing that night, and he had not heard any screams despite living close to the crime scene. The police treated Antonio very poorly during the interrogation process. At one point, an officer grabbed him by the ears and slammed his face into the table. Other officers verbally abused him. He was eventually released when the police realized that he did not have a driver's license, and it would have been extremely difficult for him to transport a body 28 kilometers without a car. The second suspect was Alicia's ex-girlfriend, Maria Dolores Vasquez. Alicia and Maria had met in 1982 when Alicia was going through divorce proceedings with her then-husband. The two shared many interests and got along well, and they moved in together in 1984. However, they kept their relationship a secret out of fear of what would happen if people knew. They told their loved ones that they were just close friends. Rocio and her siblings grew up with Maria as a stepmother, and they loved her very much. Rocio even told one of her classmates that she had 2 moms. Unfortunately, the couple broke up in 1994 and a property dispute soured the relationship. Maria had contributed more to the house, but Alicia refused to move out or pay compensation for the property. Maria herself was not well liked by her neighbors or the local community in general. She was reserved and quiet, which caused many people to think that she was cold and mean. Some people described her as unpleasant, and a former maid said that Maria had yelled at her for small mistakes. Some people believed that she had been strict with Alicia's children, punishing them for bad grades and rudeness. The police theorized that Maria had murdered Rocio in order to get revenge against Alicia, and they arrested her on October 7th of the year 2000. Various neighbors and community members waited outside her house so they could yell insults at Maria. However, when it came to the case itself, there was absolutely zero evidence indicating Maria's guilt. She did not own a Ford Fiesta, and records showed that she did not rent any vehicles at the time. The DNA on the cigarette butt belonged to a man, and the fingerprints on the garbage bag did not match Maria's. During the interrogation, Maria stated that her family had come to visit her for vacation. While her niece and husband went to the beach, Maria stayed home and took care of the niece's daughter and mother. Later that night, she called a friend, then left to go to a nearby restaurant and finally a store where she purchased some cigarettes. Several people confirmed this alibi, including the owner of the restaurant and Maria's extended family. Maria also stated that any disagreements she had with Rocio were water under the bridge. The local community had blown everything out of proportion. What did the police do in the face of so much exonerating evidence? They ignored it. They refused to question any witnesses about Maria's alibi. They didn't bother to check her phone or purchase records, and they started building a case full of circumstantial evidence against her. They received negative comments about Maria from witnesses who had only ever met her once or twice, and they took these statements at face value. Alicia's maid told the police that she had seen Maria destroying photos of Rocio with a fruit knife before she moved out, but nobody was ever able to confirm that this actually happened. A server at the restaurant Maria had gone to said that she was tense and behaving strangely. Despite the fact that this statement actually confirmed Maria's alibi, the police ignored that part and focused on Maria's behavior. They claimed that her behavior was a result of the murder. Finally, a local fortune teller told the police that Maria had asked her about the best way to get revenge on Rocio. Once again, the police took this at face value. Maria was known to be scared of the dark, so the police left her alone in the interrogation room with the lights off. They would only ever break the silence by coming in and asking her to confess. At one point, an officer said to her, "When we're done, not even your lawyer will believe you." Maria was kept in pre-trial detention, with the judge claiming that it was for her own safety due to the number of locals who might want to attack her. The police conducted a test on the textile fibers that were found on Rocio's body, and they claimed that the fibers were a match for Maria's clothing. Maria's defense team conducted their own test on the fibers and found that they did not match her clothing. The judge ignored the second test and only accepted the first. After this, Maria was subjected to a psychological evaluation, but it was a complete sham. The purpose of the evaluation was to establish Maria's sexual orientation and then claim that her supposed psychological distress was a result of that sexual orientation. In essence, the police argued that Maria's attraction to women had caused her to commit murder. She went to trial in the summer of 2001. The trial was also a total sham. The prosecution had no reliable evidence, so they resorted to attacking Maria's character and bringing up her sexual orientation constantly, basically relying on the prejudice of the jury to secure a conviction. Rocio's siblings even testified that Maria had murdered Rocio to get back at Alicia for ending their relationship. The defense proved that it was impossible to place Maria at the crime scene on the night in question, but the jury ignored this and found her guilty on September 25th of 2001. Their verdict literally quoted the prosecution almost word for word. Maria was sentenced to 15 years in prison, and she was ordered to pay 18 million pesetas in compensation to Rocio's family. However, Maria wasn't going to just let this happen. She appealed the verdict in the High Court of Andalusia, and they agreed with her appeal. On February 1st of 2002, they ordered Maria's release and a retrial. As it turns out, Maria didn't even need the retrial to prove her innocence. On August 14th of 2003, 17-year-old Sonia Carabantes and a few of her friends went to a local festival in the same city that Rocio had been murdered in. The next day, Sonia's parents realized that their daughter had never made it home and wasn't answering her phone. When they called Sonia's friends, they told them that Sonia had been dropped off at home the previous night. Her parents went out to search for her and they found bloodstains on the road. Along with the blood were Sonia's purse, phone, jeans, and shoes. There were also several pieces of orange plastic. They called the police and a volunteer search effort began, but it was too late. On August 19th, the police found a dead body in the town of Monda. It was in a creek and was half buried under a mound of rocks. Her shirt had been wrapped around her neck and the cause of death was strangulation. Her body showed clear signs of SA and her limbs had numerous bruises and other defensive wounds. Sonia had bravely fought back against her killer, and during the struggle she had scratched him. There were skin cells under her fingernails, and the police collected a sample of these cells. They were a perfect match for the saliva on the cigarette butt at the scene of Rocio's disappearance. Not long after this, a woman came forward and told law enforcement that she suspected her husband was responsible for the murders. 37-year-old British national Tony Alexander King had returned home on the night of Sonia's murder with scratches on his arm. The palm of his hand had been bandaged and there were bloodstains on his clothing. The headlights of his car had both been broken. Sonia did not go quietly. She had fought to the bitter end, and this bravery ended up being what brought Tony down. Due to his nationality being British, the Spanish police searched through records of criminals that Britain believed had fled to Spain. One of the names on this list was indeed Tony Alexander King, who was also known as the Holloway Strangler back in England. He was born as Tony Bromwich in 1967 in the Holloway district of London. According to Tony, he was physically abused by his older brother as a child. In 1986, at the age of 19, he was sentenced to 10 years in a detention center for youth offenders because he strangled and SA'd 5 women. These women survived the attacks, which was why his sentence was so short. Tony was released in 1991 after going through therapy, but he was rearrested just 6 months later for robbing a woman at gunpoint. He was sent to a regular prison and was released on parole in 1996. Following this, he decided to keep a low profile. He got a job as a waiter and changed his last name to King. He also married a Chilean woman who was pregnant at the time, and he lied to her about his criminal record, saying that he had only been convicted of an armed robbery that he had committed in an attempt to get out of poverty. For all of Tony's lies, he found himself unable to change his ways. In August of 1997, he held a Hungarian exchange student at knife point in a railway station and attempted to SA her. Immediately after this, he went home and convinced his wife to move to Spain with him, where she had relatives and he would be at a distance from his crimes. Of course, he only mentioned the first part of that to his wife. On September 2nd, CCTV footage of Tony's railway station attack aired on BBC's Crime Watch, and Scotland Yard received several phone calls from the public. These calls identified Tony as the perpetrator, but by then he had already fled the country with his wife. In March of 1998, the British authorities located Tony in Spain and they informed the Spanish authorities about his criminal record, but Spanish law enforcement considered him to be low risk, so they did not take any action against him. In the year 2000, Tony and his wife separated due to economic problems, but there was also something deeper at play. On the day of Rocio's murder, Tony returned home with mud stains on his Ford Fiesta and he cleaned the entire bathroom, which he had never done before. Tony refused to speak about this strange behavior, but his wife was extremely suspicious. Unfortunately, her suspicions were not shared by the community, who thought that Tony was a good man. In 2001, Tony found a new partner who already had 3 children and he moved in with her. His former wife never took any information to the police because she did not have any conclusive evidence against him, and she was told that her suspicions were unfounded by her friends. However, her suspicions were confirmed after Sonia's murder. The police collected a sample of Tony's DNA from a cup and compared it to the samples found at both crime scenes. They were a perfect match. Tony was arrested on September 18th of 2003, and the police searched his home shortly afterwards. They found several bloody articles of Sonia's clothing, and Tony confessed to SAing and murdering both Rocio and Sonia, as well as 3 other unsolved SA cases in the area. According to Tony, he was driving around Mijas late at night when he saw Rocio walking down the street alone. There were no witnesses and barely any light in the area, so he decided to take it as an opportunity. He approached Rocio with a dagger and attempted to SA her, but she fought back and tried to escape, which angered Tony. After getting fed up, he stabbed her multiple times, then placed her body in the trunk of his car and drove to the tennis court. He stripped her clothes to delay her identification and poured gasoline over the body, but the rainy weather had prevented the body from fully burning. The police suspected that Tony was withholding some very important information. He worked for a cleaning company that Alicia had hired before, and Maria had also worked for the same company for a brief time. They believed that Tony might have already known Rocio, but they were unable to confirm this. Tony ended up taking a job at a bar, and Sonia's home was only 10 minutes away from the bar. In his confession, he stated that he had seen her walking home before and planned her murder in advance. He hid in the bushes by the side of the road, then emerged when she walked by. He punched her once in the head, which knocked her unconscious. He then placed her in the trunk of his car and SA'd her, then beat and strangled her. He then drove to Monda and disposed of her body. The police were satisfied with these confessions and concluded that Tony was the killer. Alicia learned about Tony's arrest and confession, and she refused to accept it as the truth. She insisted that Maria was guilty despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Alicia claimed that Maria's animosity toward her was the only logical motive to murder her daughter, and she stated that Tony had no motive to do so. To this day, Alicia still insists that Maria is guilty, and she also refuses to acknowledge her sexual orientation. In fact, she has since claimed that the only reason she was in a relationship with Maria is because she was manipulated. Alicia's story made its way into the newspapers, which Tony received in prison. After reading Alicia's story, he changed his own. In April of 2004, Tony claimed that Maria had hired him to murder Rocio and that she had been the mastermind all along. According to this version of events, Sonia's murder was simply a means of throwing the police off the scent. The media ran wild with Tony's story, but law enforcement dismissed it as a ploy to get a shorter sentence. Tony's trial for Sonia's murder began in September of 2005. He underwent a psychological evaluation, which revealed antisocial and narcissistic tendencies, as well as an incessant desire to be in control. Tony showed no remorse whatsoever, and he lacked any empathy. He was considered to be a genuine threat to public safety, and experts even stated that he would almost certainly commit more murders if he was released. Nevertheless, he pled not guilty and screamed that he was innocent at reporters. On November 15th of 2005, Tony was sentenced to 36 years in prison, and he was ordered to pay Sonia's family 300,000 euros in compensation. Sonia's family was satisfied with this result. The trial for Rocio's murder began on November 20th of 2006, and Tony retracted his confession during the proceedings. He claimed that he was a scapegoat and Maria was the true killer. He also implicated another British national who was found to be completely innocent. After fits of shouting and accusing the judge and prosecutors of being criminals, Tony was removed from the courtroom. He was found guilty on December 12th and was sentenced to 19 years in prison, and he was ordered to pay Alicia 210,000 euros and Rocio's siblings 42,000 euros in compensation. The combination of Tony's sentences added up to 55 years in prison, but a stipulation was added to that sentence. It was determined that, if Tony survived his entire prison sentence, he would be banned from living in the same town as his victims' families for 15 years. Tony is being held under maximum security. He spends 21 hours per day by himself in an 8 square meter cell. He is subjected to searches and frisking every day. He was allowed outside of the prison in 2007 to attend his daughter's funeral, but he was, of course, under heavy police supervision. In 2019, he sent a letter to Alicia that repeated his story of being hired by Maria. He also tried to secure a retrial, but there wasn't a single court that was willing to treat with him. Some people suspect that Tony had at least one accomplice, but this theory has never been confirmed. A missing persons poster was found at the scene of Rocio's murder, which led people to speculate that somebody who was involved with the search effort was actually involved in the murder. The police also began investigating Tony's potential involvement in several murders that occurred in England, but nothing ever came of these efforts. In January of 2006, Maria filed a lawsuit seeking 4 million euros in compensation for her wrongful conviction and the stress that it caused her. The court awarded her 516,000 euros, with the judge arguing that the money came from her missed wages and property value. Simply being in prison wasn't enough to warrant a larger payout. She appealed this decision, but it was upheld in 2012. The courts and the media never apologized to Maria, and she eventually moved to the UK to escape the negative attention. She has since moved back to Spain and has moved on with her life.